Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Here is the first episode of the exciting adventure that comes to Frank and Joe Hardy in their third book, The Secret of the Old Mill. Almost from the very first minute, the boys seem to be plunged into the thick of a surprising situation. While they are waiting for their father to return to Bayport on the train, they are preyed upon by a dishonest man who trades their good money for a counterfeit $5 bill. Soon, counterfeit money is appearing all over town, targeting people who really can't afford to be duped. Frank and Joe really want to do something to help out their friends and neighbors. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Hardy Boys in The Secret of the Old Mill. Chapter 1. A $5 Bill. The afternoon express from the north steamed into the Bayport station to the usual accompanying uproar of clanging bells from the lunchroom, shouting redcaps, and a bellowing train announcer. Among the jostling, hurrying crowd on the platform were two pleasant-featured youths who scanned the passing coaches expectantly. "I don't see him," said Frank Hardy, the older of the pair, as he watched the passengers descending from one of the Pullman coaches. "Perhaps he stopped at some other town and intends on coming in on the local. It's only an hour later," suggested his brother Joe. The boys waited. They had met the train expecting to greet their father, Fenton Hardy, the nationally famous detective, who had been away from home for the past 2 weeks on a murder case in New York. It appeared that they were to be disappointed. When the last of the Bayport passengers left the train, Fenton Hardy was not among them. "We'll come back and meet the local," said Frank at last. The boys were about to turn away and retrace their steps down the platform when they saw a tall, well-dressed stranger swing himself down from the steps of the nearest coach. He was a man of about 30, dark and clean-shaven, and he hastened over toward them. "I want to pay a fellow $1 out of this 5, remarked the stranger as he came up to the boys. "Can you change the bill?" At the same time he produced a $5 bill from his pocket and held it out inquiringly. He was a pleasant-spoken young man and was evidently in a hurry. "I could try the lunchroom, I suppose, but there's such a crowd that I'll have trouble being waited on," he explained, the bill fluttering in his hands. Frank looked at his brother and began feeling in his pockets. "I've got $3, Joe. How about you?" Joe dug up the loose change in his possession. There was a $1 bill, a 50-cent piece, and 3 quarters. $2.25, he announced. "I guess we can make it." He handed over the $2 to Frank, who added it to the $3 of his own, and gave the money to the stranger, who gave Frank the $5 bill in exchange. "Thanks ever so much," said the young man. "You've saved me a lot of trouble. My friend is getting off at this station, and I wanted to give him the $1 before he left. Thanks." "Don't mention it," replied Frank carelessly, putting the bill in his pocket. "We'll get it changed between us." The young man nodded, smiled at them, and hastened back up the steps of the coach, with a carefree wave of his hand. "I'm glad we were able to help him out," observed Joe. "It was just by chance that I had that small change, too. Mother gave me some money to buy some pie plates." "Pie plates!" exclaimed Frank with a grin. "There's nothing I'd rather see coming into the house than more pie plates." "More pie plates mean more pie. We might as well go down and get them now before I forget. There's a shop down the street, and we can get the plates and get this $5 bill changed. It'll help kill time before the local comes in." The two lads went down the platform, out through the station to the main street of Bayport, basking in the summer sunlight. They were healthy, normal American boys of high school age. Frank, being a year older than his brother, was slightly taller. He was slim and dark, while his brother was somewhat stouter of build, with fair curly hair. As they strolled down the street, they received and returned many greetings, for both boys were well known and popular in Bayport. Before they reached the store, they heard the shriek of the whistle and the clanging of the bell that indicated that the express was resuming its southward journey. "Our friend can travel in peace," remarked Frank. "He got his 5 changed anyway, and the other fellow got his $1. Everybody's happy." They reached the store and paused outside the entrance to examine an assortment of baseball bats, discussing the relative merits and weights of each, then poked around in a tray of mitts, trying them on and agreeing that none equaled the worn and battered mitts they had at home. Finally they entered the shop, where they were greeted by the proprietor, a chubby and genial man named Mr. Moss. Mr. Moss was sitting on the counter reading a newspaper, for business was dull that afternoon, but he cast the sheet aside when they came in. "Looking for clues?" he asked humorously as they came in. As sons of Fent and Hardy, and as amateur detectives of some ability in their own right, the boys were frequently the butt of jesting remarks concerning their hobby, but they invariably took them in the spirit of good-natured raillery in which they were meant. "No clues here," continued Mr. Moss. "You won't find a single solitary clue in the place. I had a crate of awfully nice bank robbery clues in yesterday, but they've all been snapped up. I expect some nice murder clues in tomorrow morning, if you'd care to wait that long. Or perhaps you'd like me to order you a few kidnapping clues, size 8.5, guaranteed not to wear, tear, or tarnish." Mr. Moss rattled on with an air of great gravity, then burst into a roar of laughter at his own joke, and swung his feet against the side of the counter. "Well, boys, what'll it be?" he asked, rubbing his eyes, as the 2 brothers grinned at him. "What can I do for you?" "We'd like some pie plates," said Joe. 3. "Small ones, I suppose," said Mr. Moss, then chuckled hugely as the boys looked at him in indignation. "I should say not," returned Frank. "The biggest you've got." Mr. Moss laughed very much at this also, and swung himself down from the counter and went in search of the pie plates. He returned eventually with 3 that seemed to be of the required size and quality. "Wrap 'em up," said Frank, throwing the $5 bill on the counter. Mr. Moss wrapped up the plates, then picked up the bill and went over to the cash register. He rang up the amount of the sale and was about to put the money in the till when he suddenly hesitated, then held the bill up to the light. Slowly he came back to the counter, rubbing the bill between thumb and forefinger, feeling its texture and minutely examining the surface. "Where did you get this bill, boys?" he asked seriously. "We just changed it for a stranger on the train," answered Frank. "What's the matter with it?" "It looks bad to me," replied Mr. Moss dubiously. "I'm afraid I can't take a chance on it." He handed the bill back to Frank, then indicated the package on the counter. "What are you going to do about these plates?" he asked. "Have you any other money besides that bill?" "Not a nickel," said Joe, "at least not enough to pay for the plates. But do you really think the bill is no good?" "I've handled a lot of 'em. It doesn't look good to me. I tell you what you'd better do. Take it over to the bank across the street and ask the cashier what he thinks of it." The boys looked at one another in dismay. It had never occurred to them that there might be anything wrong with the money. Now it dawned on them that there had been something suspicious about the affable stranger's request. Had they really been victimized? "We'll do that," agreed Frank. "Come on, Joe. Keep those plates for us, Mr. Moss. If the bill is bad, we'll be back with some real money later on." They crossed the street to the bank and went up to the cashier's cage. They knew the cashier well, and he smiled at them as Frank pushed the $5 bill under the grating. "Want it changed?" he asked. "We want to know if it's good first." The cashier, a sharp-featured, elderly man with spectacles, then took a sharp glance at the bill. He pursed up his lips as he felt the texture of the paper. Then he flicked the bill across to them. "Sorry," he said. "You've been stung, boys. It's counterfeit." "Counterfeit!" exclaimed Frank. "You aren't the first one who's been fooled. There's been a lot of counterfeit money going around the past few days. It's very cleverly done, and it's apt to fool anyone who isn't used to handling a lot of bills. Where did you get it?" "A fellow got off the train and asked us to change it for him." The cashier nodded. "And by now he's miles away. Probably getting ready to work the same trick at the next station. I guess you'll have to pocket your loss, boys. It's tough luck." Chapter 2. Counterfeit Money. The Hardy Boys left the bank, feeling at once foolish and wrathful. "Stung!" declared Frank. "Stung by a counterfeit bill. Oh, if the fellows hear of this, we'll never hear the end of it. What a fine pair of greenhorns we must have looked to that slick stranger. I'd like to lay my hands on him for about 5 seconds. I'll bet he's been laughing to himself ever since about how easily we were fooled." "I'll say we were easy. We hadn't a suspicion in the world." "After all," Joe remarked, "that bill might have fooled anyone. You can't deny that it looks mighty like a real 5. They halted on the corner and again examined the money. Only an experienced eye could have detected any difference between the counterfeit bill and a genuine one. It was crisp and new, and appeared in every respect identical with any bona fide $5 bill that had ever been legitimately issued by the federal government. "If we were dishonest, we could palm this off on almost anyone, just as we had it palmed off on us," said Joe. "Oh, well, live and learn. I hate to think of that fellow laughing at us, though. It's a nice price to pay for a lesson not to be too trustful of strangers after this." "It cost me more than it cost you," Frank pointed out. "It was just my luck that I had $3 on me and you only had 2. This phase of the matter had not occurred to Joe before, so he felt considerably more cheerful in the thought that he had not, after all, been the chief loser. They went back to the store and dolefully reported to Mr. Moss that he had been right in his surmise about the bill. "It was bad, all right," Frank told him. "The cashier took one look at it, and that was enough." Mr. Moss nodded sympathetically. "Well, it's too bad you were stung," he said, "but I'd rather it was you than me. In business, we have to be careful. As a matter of fact, I think it would have fooled me, only the bank warned me this morning that there was some counterfeit money going around, and that I'd better be on my guard against any new bills. The minute I saw your 5 was fresh and new, I got suspicious. It's certainly a clever imitation. Whoever is putting the stuff out is a real artist at that game." "We'll be back for the pie plates later on," promised Joe, "but we didn't want you to think we were trying to pass bad money on you." Mr. Moss laughed at the idea. "Ha! The Hardy Boys pass counterfeit money!" he exclaimed. "I know you better than that, I hope. I'll keep the plates for you, or you can take 'em now and bring back the money later. Good money, though," he added, wagging his finger at them. "We'll be back," they told him. They went toward the station to wait for the local train on which they expected their father to arrive. And while they waited, sitting on a platform bench, they gloomily discussed the imposition of which they had been the victims. "It isn't so much losing my $3, declared Frank. "It's the thought of being fooled by such a simple trick. We should have known that the fellow had plenty of time to get his money changed at the lunch counter, or at the cigar stand, or even the ticket office. Instead of that, we dug into our pockets like lambs." Lambs don't have pockets," Joe pointed out. "All the better for 'em. They're so innocent they'd be fleeced of everything they put in 'em anyway, just like us. We handed over all our money to a total stranger, and let him give us a bad bill that we didn't even take the trouble to look at. I wish somebody would kick me all around the block." While the Hardy Boys are sitting on the bench, gloomily awaiting the arrival of their father, and preparing to tell him of how they'd been fooled by the stranger, it will not be out of place to introduce them still further to the readers of this volume. As related in the first volume of this series, The Hardy Boys in the Tower Treasure, Frank and Joe Hardy were the sons of Fenton Hardy, a private detective of international fame. Mr. Hardy, who had been for many years on the New York police force, and who had later resigned to carry on a private detective practice, was a criminologist of note. He knew by sight and by reputation most of the notorious criminals of his day, and his mastery over all the branches of his profession was such as to place him at the very forefront of American detectives. So great had been the demand for his services in solving the mysteries of crimes that had baffled the detective forces of other cities, that he had found it much more lucrative to carry on a practice of his own than to remain attached to the service of any one city, even such a city as the great American metropolis. Fenton Hardy, with his wife Laura Hardy, and their 2 sons, Frank and Joe, had accordingly moved to Bayport, a city of about 50,000 inhabitants, situated on Barmet Bay on the Atlantic Ocean. There Frank and Joe had gone to school until now they were in the Bayport High School. Both boys were fully conscious of the fame of their father, and were eager to follow in his footsteps, although their mother had expressed a desire that they fit themselves for some less hazardous and more conventional profession. However, the Hardy boys had inherited much of their father's ability and deductive talent. Already they had aided in solving 2 mysteries that had kept Bayport by the ears. As related in The Hardy Boys and the Tower Treasure, they had solved the mystery of the theft of valuable jewels and bonds from Tower Mansion, even after Fenton Hardy himself had been unable to discover where the thief had hidden the loot. In the 2nd volume of the series, The Hardy Boys in The House on the Cliff, it has been told how the Hardy Boys discovered the haunt of a gang of smugglers who were operating in Barmet Bay. In this case, they had received a substantial reward, as federal agents had tried in vain to locate the smugglers' base of activities for many months. Following the adventures at the house on the cliff, an uneventful winter and spring had passed, the boys devoting themselves to their studies and to an occasional winter holiday. Christmas had come with many presents, and now warm weather was once more at hand. Because of the pride they took in their achievements as amateur detectives, the Hardy boys felt very keenly the shame of being so easily fooled by the stranger who had passed the counterfeit money upon them. "Dad'll have the laugh on us now," muttered Joe, as they heard the distant whistle of the approaching train. "Well, we'll tell him about it anyway. Who knows but what a big case might arise out of this?" The afternoon local pulled into the station, and Fenton Hardy stepped down from the parlor car, bag in hand, light coat over one arm. He was a tall, dark-haired man of about 40 years of age. He had a quick, pleasant smile for his sons, and he shook hands with them warmly. "How's Mother?" he asked, after the first greetings. "She's fine," replied Frank. "She said there'd be something special for supper tonight, seeing you're back." "Good. And what have you 2 been doing? Kept out of mischief, I hope?" "Well, we've kept out of mischief," said Joe, "but we haven't kept out of trouble." "What's the matter?" "We just got fooled by a smart stranger who stepped off the express. It cost us $5. "How did that happen?" "He asked us to change a $5 bill for him." "Aha!" exclaimed Fenton Hardy, raising his eyebrows. "And what then?" "It was counterfeit." Mr. Hardy looked grave. "Have you got it with you?" "Yes," answered Frank, producing the bill. "I don't think we can be blamed such an awful lot for being fooled. It certainly looks mighty like a good one." Fenton Hardy put down his bag and examined the bill closely for a moment. Then he folded it up and put it in his waistcoat pocket. "I'll take care of this if you don't mind," he said, picking up his bag and beginning to walk toward the station exit. "As it happens, I know something about this money." "What do you mean, Dad?" asked Frank quickly. "I don't mean that I know anything about this particular $5 bill, but I know something about this counterfeit money in general. As a matter of fact, that is why this trip took me longer than I thought it would. When I finished the case that originally took me away, the government called me in on this counterfeit money case. Is there a lot of it going around? Too much. Within the past few weeks, the East has been flooded with it, and the circulation seems to be spreading. There seems to be a central counterfeiting plant somewhere, with experts in charge of it, and they're turning out imitation bills so clever that the average person can hardly detect them. The federal authorities are worrying a great deal about it. And is this one of the bills? It looks just like some of the others that have been turned in, although chiefly they have been dealing in 10s and 20s. The man who stepped off the train was probably one of their agents, trying to convert as much of the counterfeit money into good cash as he could. When he saw that you were only boys, he thought there would be a better chance of getting change for $5 than 10. Then, of course, he may only have been someone who'd been fooled by the counterfeit and decided to get rid of it by passing it on to someone else. I wish he'd asked us to change one of his counterfeit 10s instead, mourned Joe. We would have been $5 to the good. Chapter 3. The Hardy Boys at School. If the boys had any lingering hopes that their school chums would not hear of the manner in which they had been fooled, these hopes were quickly removed next morning. Scarcely had Frank and Joe ascended the concrete steps of Bayport High than Chet Morton, a stout, chubby boy of about 16, one of their closest friends, a lad with a passion for practical jokes, came solemnly toward them with a green tobacco coupon in his hand. "Just the fellows I'm looking for," he chirped. "My great-grandmother just died in Abyssinia, and I'm trying to raise the railway fare to go to the funeral. How about changing this 100? There was a roar of laughter from about a dozen boys who were standing about, for Chet had evidently acquainted them all with the affair of the previous day. How he had learned of it, Frank and Joe could not imagine. They grinned good-naturedly, although Joe blushed furiously. "What's the matter?" asked Chet innocently. "Can't you change it? You don't mean to tell me you can't change my $100 bill? Please, kind young gentleman, please change my $100 bill, for if you don't, I'm sure nobody else will, and then I won't be able to go to my great-grandmother's funeral in Abyssinia." He wiped away an imaginary tear. "Sorry," said Frank gravely. "We're not in the money-changing business." "You mean you're not in it any more?" pointed out Chet. "You were in the business yesterday, I know. What's the matter? Retire on your profits?" "Yes, we quit." "I don't blame you." Suddenly Chet struck an attitude of exaggerated surprise. "Why, bless my soul! I do believe this bill is bad." He peered at the flimsy tobacco coupon very closely, then whipped a small magnifying glass from his pocket and squinted through it. At last he raised his head with a sigh. "Yes, sir, it's bad. It's counterfeit. One of the cleverest counterfeits I ever saw. If it hadn't been for the fact that there's no $100 mark on it, and if it hadn't been that there's a picture of the president of the El Ropo Tobacco Company instead of Ben Franklin, I'd have been completely fooled. Isn't it lucky that you boys didn't change it for me? Isn't it lucky? Congratulations, young sirs, congratulations." He shook Frank and Joe warmly by the hand, in the meantime keeping a very solemn face, while the other lads surged about in a laughing group and joined in the kidding. They jested unmercifully about the incident of the counterfeit $5, but the Hardy Boys took it all in good part. The news had leaked out through Mr. Moss, who had told Jerry Gilroy, one of the Hardy Boys' chums, about the affair just a short while after they had left the store the previous afternoon. Jerry had lost no time acquainting Chet and the others with the details. "If you keep on changing money for strangers, you won't have much left out of those rewards," declared Phil Cohen, a diminutive black-haired Jewish boy who was one of their friends. He was referring to the money the Hardy Boys had received in rewards for their work in the Tower Mansion case, and for helping run down the smugglers. "Oh, I guess we'll still have a few dollars," replied Frank smilingly. "We have enough in the bank to buy a motorboat with, anyway." "What's that?" asked Chet quickly. "Are you getting a motorboat?" The Hardy Boys nodded. Their chums were immediately interested. "Put me down for one of the first passengers," shouted Biff Hooper, a tall, broad-shouldered boy who had just pushed his way through the circle. "We're thinking of getting one like Tony Prito's," said Joe. "I wish it was mine," exclaimed Tony. His father, one of the most respected citizens in the Italian colony of Bayport, owned a speedy motorboat, which had proved of great service to the Hardy Boys in their conflict with the smugglers of Barmet Bay. "But if you're getting a boat at all, you can't do any better than get one just like it. Dad told us last night we could get one as long as we stayed in the bay and along the coast with it. He was afraid we might get ambitious and try crossing the Atlantic." "Well," remarked Jerry Gilroy, "I see where our summer baseball league is shot to pieces now." "Why?" "You'll be out in that boat every minute of your spare time. It was bad enough when you had the motorcycles. You were both always roaming around the country on 'em. But now we'll never be able to find you at all. There goes the best pitcher and shortstop of my team together." Jerry looked very glum as he said this, for he was an ardent ball fan, and he had been much in the forefront in the organizing of a league for the summer months. Frank Hardy was one of the best pitchers in the school, and Joe could cover short in a manner that was the envy of his companions. But in spite of their natural ability for the game, the Hardy Boys had always shown a preference for outings instead of baseball. "I'd rather go out for a whole day on a motorcycle or in a motorboat than play a dozen ball games," said Frank. This was rank heresy to Jerry, who could not bear any reflections on his beloved game. "Gosh, I don't know what's to become of you two. Can't I count on you for any games at all?" "Sure you can," promised Frank. "We're not going to live in the motorboat." "If you go fooling around Barmet Reefs on a stormy day in the old tub, you'll die in it, though," snickered Chet. "That'll be about enough for you," warned Frank, giving him a friendly dig in the ribs. Then, turning to Jerry, he went on, "We'll play on your team, but we won't spend all our time outside of meal hours in practicing." "Well, I suppose I should be satisfied. We can't have everything. But I'd imagine you'd like to practice." "They don't need to," declared Chet. "That's why you have to spend all your spare time learning how to catch. Even now you're not much good at it." He winked at Tony Prito, who was standing behind Jerry. "Why, I bet you can't catch a measly little fly like this. Look." He took a baseball out of his pocket and threw it lightly into the air. It did not go very high, and it was a ridiculously easy catch for anyone. As for Jerry Gilroy, who was really a star outfielder, it was scarcely worth the effort. He had but to step back a pace and the ball was his. "Can't I?" he said, somewhat nettled by Chet's words. The ball arched through the air and descended directly toward him. He stepped back, prepared to make the easy catch. But Tony Prito had caught Chet's wink and knew what it meant, for they had carefully rehearsed the trick between them. As soon as Chet had thrown the ball, Tony knelt on his hands and knees on the grass immediately behind Jerry. For all his seeming carelessness, Chet had thrown the ball just far enough so that Jerry would have to step back to make the catch. Jerry collided with the recumbent figure behind him. He staggered, lost his balance, and tumbled over Tony Prito, while the baseball thumped into the grass. The other boys, who had seen the joke from the start, laughed uproariously as Jerry picked himself up and betook himself in pursuit of the already fleeing Tony, while Chet, with an air of vast satisfaction, picked up the baseball. "I knew he couldn't catch it," he said, with all the airy disdain of a minor prophet. Just then, the gong in the main hall of Bayport High began to clang, summoning the students to their classes, and the boys crowded through the wide doorway. Chapter 4. Another Victim. When he took his place in class that morning, Frank Hardy glanced over at the desk 2 aisles away, where Callie Shaw was sitting. Callie, a brown-haired, brown-eyed miss with a quick, vivacious manner, was one of the prettiest girls attending Bayport High School. She was Frank's favorite of all the girls in the city, and each morning he glanced over at her desk and never failed to receive a bright and fleeting smile that somehow made the dusty classroom seem a trifle less drab and monotonous. And when she was not there, it always seemed that the day had gotten away to a bad start. She was there this morning, but she was gazing soberly at her books, and she failed to return Frank's glance with her usual smile. This was something so utterly extraordinary that Frank gazed at her open-mouthed for a second or two, until, recollecting himself, he turned to his own books and proceeded to spend much of the time until recess in a state of helpless wonderment. Like the average boy under such circumstances, he racked his brains trying to recollect what he could have done that might have offended Callie. But there seemed to be no solution to the mystery. Perhaps she had heard of how he'd been fooled by the stranger yesterday. Perhaps she felt contempt for him because he'd been so easily outwitted. This was one of his wild surmises, but he rejected it, because it was not like Callie to be angry about anything, unless there was good reason for her displeasure. At last he gave it up, and tried to dismiss the matter from his mind, but several times during the morning he cast covert glances in her direction. But Callie was plainly worried and downcast. She seldom raised her eyes from her books. She answered the teacher's questions in a most abstracted manner, and altogether it appeared that there was something on her mind beyond schoolwork. When recess came, she walked slowly out of the room, not mingling with the other girls. Frank saw her go outside toward the campus, where she sat down on the grass by herself, watching an impromptu basketball game, and declining all requests to join in the fun. He went over to her and flung himself down on the grass beside the girl. "What's the matter, Callie?" She looked up at him and smiled faintly. "Hello, Frank. Where did you drop from?" "I've been sitting right across from you in school all morning, and this is the first time you've noticed that I'm alive." "I'm sorry, Frank. I didn't mean to be rude. I've got something on my mind this morning, that's all."
"Trouble?"
She nodded.
"What about?"
"Money." He was puzzled by this remark. Callie lived with her cousin, Miss Polly Shaw, the proprietor of a beauty parlor in the city, and although Miss Shaw was not rich, she made a comfortable living. Therefore, when Frank heard Callie say that she was worried about money, he was naturally puzzled. Callie's parents lived in the country, but they sent their daughter frequent remittances to pay the expenses of her education in Bayport.
"What's the matter?" he asked. "Didn't your allowance come?"
"No, it isn't that. I'm all right. It's Polly. She lost some money, more than she could afford."
"Lost some? How was that?"
"She lost $50 last night."
Frank whistled. "Whoa, that's a lot of money."
"It certainly is. The worst of it is that Polly had just made the final payment on some new electrical fixtures in the shop, and it had left her pretty short of cash. I feel bad about it for her sake."
"How did it happen?"
"A woman came into the store last night and bought some beauty preparations. Quite a large order. It amounted to about $12, and she had nothing less than a $50 bill in her purse. Polly had that much money in the till, for it was near the end of the day, and she didn't like to lose the order, so she changed the bill." Frank nodded soberly. He knew now what had happened.
"And the money was counterfeit," he said.
"Why, how did you know?" exclaimed Callie.
"I was fooled myself yesterday."
Frank then went on to tell Callie how he and Joe had been victimized by the stranger on the station platform.
"Dad says there's a lot of this counterfeit money being circulated," he said. "They certainly aren't losing much time in getting rid of it around Bayport. Gee, first a 5 and now a 50. I'm sure sorry that Polly is out that much money."
"Yes, it is a big amount," declared Callie. "Of course, She'll get along, but no one likes to lose that much."
"Did she know the woman?"
"Oh, no, she was a total stranger. She was rather handsome and was well dressed. Polly didn't suspect anything wrong. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until she picked up the paper after work last night and read that the banks had issued a warning about counterfeit money that she began to think about it. So she called up Mr. Wilkins, who works in one of the banks, and he came over and took a close look at the bill. He said right away that it was no good, although he admitted it was so cleverly done that anyone might be fooled by it."
"Just what they said about my 5. Did Polly tell the police?"
"I suppose she's told them by now, but she gave me the bill and asked me to turn it over to your father."
"Good. Dad happens to be working along those lines just now. Have you got the bill with you?"
"It's in my purse in the cloakroom. I'll let you have it at lunch hour." So when school was dismissed at noon, Callie gave Frank the counterfeit $50 bill. Frank examined it closely. Like the $5 bill he and Joe had changed for the plausible stranger the previous day, it was crisp and new. Frank had seen very few $50 bills in his life, either genuine or otherwise, but he realized that this specimen was a very good imitation. The mere fact that such bills are not often seen by the average person no doubt rendered it easier to pass without being readily detected.
"I'll show this to my father," he promised Callie. "I'm afraid it won't do much good. Polly will have to stand her loss, unless she can trace the woman who passed the bill on her. But perhaps this will help Dad find the source of all this counterfeit money."
"Goodness knows how many poor people are being victimized just as Polly was," said the girl. "I hope they catch the people who are at the bottom of it."
When Joe joined Frank on the school steps, Frank told him about the incident at the beauty parlor, and of how Polly Shaw had lost $50 in goods and money to the strange woman. "Of course," said Frank, "she may have been perfectly innocent in passing that $50 bill, and perhaps she didn't realize it was counterfeit. But I'm beginning to think this gang has a number of people traveling around, getting rid of the imitation bills. Once they get 'em into circulation, they'll go from hand to hand until the banks check them up. Somebody is bound to lose in the end, and usually it's the honest person who finds out that the money is bad and won't pass it any further. The crooked ones will just try to get rid of it as quickly as they can."
When they reached home, Frank told his father about Polly Shaw and handed over the counterfeit bill.
"So they're dealing in 50s now," exclaimed Fenton Hardy as he looked at the money.
"Do you think it's made by the people who turned out that bad 5 that we got stung on?" Joe asked. Mr. Hardy drew a magnifying glass from his vest pocket and made a close scrutiny of the bill.
"It seems to have been printed on the same press, but I'm not sure," he announced at last. "These things are so cleverly done that it would take an expert to notice any differences."
He proceeded then to examine the $5 bill, comparing it closely with the 50, and at last he put the glass back into his pocket.
"I'm practically certain that these bills were issued from the same press. The paper seems to be of the same kind, just a shade lighter than the paper used in genuine bills, and there are certain little differences in the engraving that are almost identical on each piece of money. Miss Shaw won't mind if I keep this, will she?" he asked Frank.
"She asked me to give it to you."
"I'll send both these bills to an expert in the city, and we'll get his opinion on it."
Mrs. Hardy, a pretty, fair-haired woman, sighed. "I'm sure I don't know what the world is coming to," she said, "when men will make bad money and know that poor people are going to lose by it. It's a shame."
"There's nothing some of 'em won't stop at when it comes to filling their own pockets," declared her husband. "But perhaps when the expert sends me his report on these bills, I'll have something more to work on. If it turns out that there is one central gang circulating this money, we'll all have to be on the lookout."
Chapter 5. Curing the Joker. Hard work in school occupied the attention of the boys for the rest of the week, for examination time was near,
and even Jerry Gilroy was obliged to dismiss baseball from his mind in a frantic attempt to catch up with his geometry and Latin that somehow appeared to keep perpetually ahead of him. Frank and Joe sweated over the ablative absolute and grumbled over the heroic exploits that could be resurrected from the deathless lines of Caesar and Virgil, if one could but distinguish verbs from nouns, and wondered, as schoolboys have wondered from time immemorial, why they should be obliged to concern themselves with things that happened 2,000 years ago, and more, when they might be outside playing. When Friday night came, they emerged from the haze of declensions and vocabularies, axioms and theorems, equations and symbols, in which they had been engulfed all week, and decided that Saturday should see them as far away from school as possible. "Let's get out of the city altogether," suggested Frank, as the Hardy boys left the classroom on Friday afternoon. "What say we all go for a hike out into the country?" "Suits me," agreed Chet. "No motorcycles either. Let's walk." "Good idea," Jerry Gilroy approved. "Unless," he said hopefully, "you fellows would like to come up to the campus and have baseball practice." "Another smart remark like that out of you, and I'll practice my famous left hook on your jaw," warned Biff Hooper, squaring off in a pugilistic attitude. "We don't want to see or hear of this school again until Monday morning, and that'll be too soon." All right," said Jerry placatingly. "I just thought I'd mention it." "And I just think you'll forget about it," said Chet. "You'll come along on this hike with us. Here, have an apple and keep quiet." He dug into the inexhaustible recesses of his pockets and produced a slightly shop-worn apple, which he thrust into Jerry's hands. "There, see if that'll keep you quiet for a while." Jerry, who could never resist anything in the nature of food, accepted the donation eagerly. "Where shall we go on this hike?" he asked, raising the fruit to his lips. "I was thinking we could go up to Carl Stummer's farm," suggested Joe. Mother was saying she wondered if Stummer would let her have any cherries to can this year. This would be a good time to ask him. "Suits me," said Jerry, taking a prodigious bite of the apple. Then an expression of pained surprise crossed his face, to be replaced by a look of ghastly realization. Tears spurted to his eyes and his jaws worked convulsively. Then he emitted a gurgle of agony, spluttered, spat out the apple, and began to dance around on the pavement, waving his arms in the air. "Huh, it's like he has red ants in his pants," commented Chet gravely, clapping his hands. "Fine work, Jerry. Do it again." "Pepper!" spluttered Jerry. "I'm burning up! Water!" "Call the fire brigade," advised Chet, bursting into a shriek of laughter. The other lads gazed at their companion in amazement until his wild antics became too much for them, and they all roared as Jerry continued his frantic splutterings. Wildly, the victim turned toward the school again. There was a water fountain near the front door, and he headed toward it. But his eyes were so full of tears from the mouthful of red pepper that he had gulped when he bit into the hollow apple that he did not see a flower bed in his path. Jerry stumbled over the wire border and sprawled full length among the blossoms. The janitor, a cantankerous individual named McBain, had been standing nearby, watching the performance with a broad grin on his usually dour features. But when he saw Jerry fall into his precious flower bed, he gave a roar of fury. "Away with ye!" he bellowed. "Away from my flowers, you young limb! I'll have you reported." McBain's temper was aroused. The rest of the boys scattered, fearing the wrath to come. Jerry managed to scramble out of the flower bed just as the janitor reached him. He jumped out of reach of the outstretched hand, with the result that McBain lost his balance and overstepped the border, treading on some choice blossoms and getting tangled up in the wire. Jerry made for the fountain and was already taking deep gulps of the cool water when McBain, now spluttering unintelligible phrases, got out of the flower bed and thundered toward him. With a longing glance at the spouting water, for his raging thirst was not yet appeased, and with a fearful glance at the approaching janitor, Jerry turned and fled. He joined his laughing companions at the street corner, and with his shamefaced air admitted that the joke had been on him. McBain gave up the chase, vowing threats of vengeance on the following Monday. "He'll forget all about it by then," assured Phil. "I won't forget about it," declared Jerry. "Next time anybody